Okay, welcome to the Get Fit with Jodelle podcast. I am Jodelle as usual, and today I have back with me Georgi Dinkov. So, hi Georgie, how's it going?
Hello, how are you?
Wonderful, and always a thrill to have you on. I know we get a lot of great feedback from people that love these podcasts that specifically break down, certain issues that many of us are dealing with, and then also what we can do about it, what supplements we can take. And just on the note of supplements, I wanted to just really thank you for your information and for the good products that you're putting out there with Idealabs. I, as a practitioner, am always trying to find the best supplements for my clients that I myself use and can recommend, and really appreciate that they're going to do what they say they're going to do. And that's why I promote your products, is because every single one of them that I have used or that a client has used has gotten benefits. And so you have really put together a well-researched library of supplements that I appreciate, and that's why I think people should know the importance of supplementation. We don't live in a world anymore where we can rely on getting everything from our food and from our environment, unfortunately. Yep. Unfortunately, now we're in a modernized society where we are bombarded with EMF, radiation, toxic lighting, and then chemicals in our water, in our foods, and poor mineral absorption in our food and in our soil. And so I think people might poo-poo sometimes supplements, but really we need them in today's world. We don't live in the world we were supposed to live in. So I just want to thank you for that and what you're putting together, and really commend you for helping a lot of people.
Appreciate it. I mean, I'm glad to hear it's helping. So that's what keeps me going. So for as long as there's interest, for as long as I can feel that it benefits somebody, even one person, I'll keep doing it.
Awesome. And today we're specifically talking about thyroid. So in some of the podcasts, we've touched on the importance of having an optimally functioning thyroid, or thyroid issues we've touched on, but this one is specifically geared towards just the thyroid, and just getting some information out about how we can optimize it, what we can do to prevent hypothyroidism, or maybe even reverse some of the issues that we're having. So let's jump right into the thyroid. They're more prevalent than ever, these thyroid issues, or low thyroid function, as well as hypothyroidism. So talk to me about, what are the main reasons why there is so much of a thyroid issue going on?
So I guess we can probably lump everything into the overall topic of stress, but there are many types of stress. There's chemical stress, and then we can talk about endocrine disruptors and how this affects the thyroid. And there's the classic notion of stress, which people think of when you say somebody's under stress. But ultimately, they all have a very similar, both the classic stress and the chemical stressors that are around us. Ultimately, it all comes down to some very specific mechanisms through which they suppress the thyroid gland, and in some cases can cause issues like Hashimoto disease, which is really just like basically the body's reaction to a chronically stressed thyroid gland. It's not really an autoimmune disease. And when it was first discovered, actually nobody referred to it as an autoimmune disease. It was known, or at least strongly suspected, to be due to chronic exposure to some kind of a stress, or like acute trauma, being in a car accident, losing a loved one, being to war, or any kind of like a similar, going through a divorce, any kind of a stressor like that was known to be able to cause it. So the first group, the so-called endocrine disruptors, just as you mentioned, there's so many things that are around us, and these chemicals that are mostly in plastics, but not just in plastics. Many of the pesticides, there are these the chemicals known as bisphenols that are mostly coming from plastics. The chemicals that are coming from Teflonated, like kitchen appliances, all of these things have detrimental effects on the thyroid gland, and they act as endocrine disruptors. Perhaps the most well-known ones are the bisphenols, especially bisphenol type A, known as BPA, because it actually mimics, it works exactly like the hormone estrogen. And it is a very powerful activator of the estrogen receptor in the body, which means it acts basically just like estrogen does. On top of that, it acts as a thyroid receptor antagonist and also androgen receptor antagonist. So it's like this small molecule combines in itself three of the most detrimental effects you can ask for in a chemical. So it suppresses your thyroid. It doesn't suppress the thyroid gland directly, even though that comes later. But even if you're producing normal levels of thyroid hormone, this molecule, if it's inside your organism, it's going to prevent the thyroid doing its job, right? It's going to block that receptor where the thyroid needs to work. On top of that, it's going to act like estrogen, so you'll have carcinogenic effects, especially in the breast, but also in the uterus, the ovaries, the cervix. And for men, I mean, many people think of estrogen as a hormone only relevant for female cancers. It's really not true. At this point, it's known to be involved in colon cancer, gastric cancer, pancreatic cancer, glioblastomas, and most of these cancers actually tend to favor, quote unquote, there's nothing favorable here, but they occur more often in males, and estrogen is involved in all of these. So you know, as a summary, the endocrine disruptors have a powerful effect of opposing the effects of the thyroid hormone. Now, on top of that, anything that raises estrogen or acts similar to estrogen in the organism, it's going to actually suppress thyroid function. That's how it works. I mean, basically, estrogen, serotonin, prolactin, these are all hormones that are their main effect is to suppress the oxidation of glucose and increase the oxidation of fat. On top of that, they actually have the capability of causing tissue disintegration, specifically estrogens. And it's not a coincidence that diseases, autoimmune diseases like Hashimoto disease, which is the, you know, sort of like an autoimmune condition of the thyroid, it occurs in a ratio of 5-to-1 to almost 8-to-1 in women. And you know, the ratio was always higher traditionally, but before the mass usage of birth control pills that contain estrogen and us being flooded with these endocrine disruptors, basically both the rates of the Hashimoto disease were lower, and also the ratio of females to males was maybe about 2-to-1. Now, with the females being exposed to additional estrogens, the ratio has climbed dramatically, and also the rates in both sexes of this condition have climbed dramatically. So EMF, you mentioned EMF, we're being blasted by EMF everywhere. EMF has a known suppressive effect on the thyroid gland, and many studies with animals show that all you need is about 30 minutes of exposure to a level of EMF that will be comparable to you sitting 3 feet away from your router, like your Wi-Fi router at home. If you're there, you better put some distance between you and the router, even though the power of the exposure of the electromagnetic waves decreases the square of the distance between you and the router. When the researchers did the study with animals, they put them away 3 feet. They put them 3 feet away from the router, and still within 30 minutes, they already saw like dramatically decreased levels of the so-called active thyroid hormone T3 in the blood, right? And they also saw rise of the thyroid stimulating hormone, which is released by the pituitary. And that usually happens when the body senses that it doesn't have enough thyroid, right? Which is what happened. I mean, if the thyroid gland is suppressed, then there's not enough thyroid being put out in the bloodstream, and as a response, the pituitary says, "Oh, I'm running low on thyroid. I need to produce more." Then it pumps out more TSH into the blood. TSH, unfortunately, like most pituitary hormones, TSH itself has a number of unfortunate effects on the body. I mean, it's now known to be involved in melanoma. It's now known to be involved in miscarriages. It's now known to be involved in preeclampsia and eclampsia in pregnant women. So it really, like most of the pituitary hormones, at best should be kept as low as possible within the physiological range. So anything that raises the pituitary hormones should be treated as something that you probably don't want to be exposed to for too long. And EMF is one such factor. Blue light. Many of us, if not most of us that work in an office environment are blasted all the time by these fluorescent lights that are very heavy in the blue spectrum of the light. Now they've changed them a little bit lately, and so now that they look more like sunlight, but it's still, in the vast majority of office buildings, they're going to install the cheapest lights that they have access to, because businesses try to keep costs low, and the cheapest ones are still the bluish tinted fluorescent lights. And my building is no exception, even though it's a newer building, even though it's, advertised itself as like a very hip place to work, but still the lights that we get are very much of the bad kind. Why they're bad? Because the blue light is a powerful suppressive effect on oxidative metabolism in the cell. So it suppresses the activity of cytochrome C oxidase, which is the crucial component of respiration, and it's the last step before the energy that we're getting from food meets with oxygen, and basically this completes the whole step of metabolism. So without that crucial step, that last step, we're basically stuck in a constant buildup of electrons from food, which we cannot utilize, and this wreaks all kinds of havoc. I mean, anytime you have a buildup of free electrons, fatty acid synthesis is increased because the body has to dispose of this energy somehow, and storing it is one method, right? And if this continues for too long, eventually start getting fibrotic changes in organs and even cancer. So it's not a coincidence that most of those studies that have looked at blue light exposure, especially fluorescent light exposure, have found in the short term conditions like migraines, premenstrual syndrome in women, migraines in both sexes, problems with sleep because the blue light suppresses your synthesis of melatonin, joint problems, infertility, and if there's chronic exposure, eventually the studies also found a very high correlation and increase in most cancers, and they correlated very well with exposure to blue light. So all of these things, and how is this important for the thyroid? Well, your thyroid gland also depends on itself producing energy so that it can produce thyroid hormone, right? Same thing with your reproductive organs. So it all comes down to how well specific tissue and or organ synthesizes energy from food. And if you interfere with that process, that organ / tissue is going to start to suffer. Same thing with it's no different for the thyroid gland. So its output, which is the thyroid hormone T4, actually it's a pre-hormone, and then it gets converted into T3 in the liver. So if you get exposed to blue light, your thyroid gland will not put out as much T4. As a consequence, the suboptimal hormone from the pituitary, TSH, will rise. And since blue light affects every organ and every tissue, even if your thyroid was producing enough T4, when it gets shuttled to the liver, where most of the conversion of T4 into T3 happens, if your liver is malfunctioning, and it probably already is given all the poisons we're eating and all the unsaturated fats and all the stress we're under and all the estrogens, right? So then, the exposure to blue light will hinder the conversion of T4 into T3 even more. So in one sentence, basically, anything that interferes with the ability of the cell to produce energy from food will likely have a detrimental effect. And there are many factors that interfere with that process. The endocrine disruptors being one, the EMF exposure being second, regular daily stress, which most of us are exposed to. Your boss yells at you, you have a fight at home, or basically you're stuck in traffic for too long, you're late for some meeting, and just being stuck in the car, there's a buildup of carbon monoxide. There are all of these peripheral things that most of us are not even aware of that are attacking us from all directions. So the cumulative effect of this is a chronic downregulation of thyroid gland output, right? Chronic upregulation of the pituitary hormone TSH, which, as I explained earlier, is not really optimal. You don't want it to be elevated for too long, but it will be if the body senses that it doesn't have enough thyroid, right? And then basically, so the combination of low thyroid output, elevated TSH, and low conversion of T4 into T3 in the liver, because the liver is also affected by all of these stressors. The combination of all these factors put us in a stage of chronic mild hypothyroidism for most people. But for a significant population now, this is turning into more severe cases of actual subclinical hypothyroidism, which is defined as having TSH above the normal range, which I don't know if many people realize, but it was recently lowered. So for decades, the normal range for TSH was, I think, from 2 to 6, right? And if you go to your doctor and you had a TSH of 5, you'll be labeled as perfectly happy. If you ask for thyroid, they will yell you out of the room or potentially even refer you to a psychiatrist. But now they suddenly lowered the normal range down to 4. So all of these people who were labeled psychopaths and mentally ill and disturbed and looking for attention and wasting the doctor's times, that had a TSH between 4 and 6. So suddenly now these people are patients. So how can you trust a doctor who kept vilifying you for years, if this was the case, and suddenly now they're all accepting, saying, you know what, we were wrong. Okay, well, I think that's really the problem with medicine. They're so rigidly focused on how right they are that when things turn out to not be the case, and this is really how life works. Most of the time we're wrong, so we should keep an open mind and accept new information and incorporate it and continuously improve our knowledge. That's not how it works with medicine. It's really about A and B and black and white, and then they get to define when black turns into white and the other way around. And there's no question. If you question, you label a problem. So bottom line, a significant, probably the majority of the population are suffering from mild hypothyroidism as a result of these malfunctioning thyroid, overactive pituitary, and underperforming liver, right? And then for some people, a significant percentage, and it keeps rising, these issues turn into more serious issues such as Hashimoto disease or subclinical hypothyroidism, which means TSH between 4 and 9, right? Multiple studies came out that show that if your TSH is above 2, which by the way happens to be, I think, the lower range of normal under the new guidelines, actually it's 1, but multiple studies show that if your TSH is over 2, it is almost impossible for you to be healthy. And unfortunately, for as long as this range gets continued to define like that, there will be many people who are technically healthy who still aren't. So if we take the population who has a TSH above 2, then you're looking at least 80% of the population.
Yeah.
That's the majority. Could be even more. And it's rapidly rising because we're under continuous assault. And then within those 80%, I would say about a third of them are probably already in the range of subclinical hypothyroidism. And even though the doctor so as soon as you're over 4, then the doctor will consider treating you with thyroid. No, but as I explained, 80% of the people are probably in some need of thyroid supplement because we're under this continuous assault, which puts us in a hypothyroid state. But even if you don't believe in that, at this point, you can probably look at, if you take the population and random sample it and check their levels of TSH, I would say about a third will probably come back as actually officially needing a thyroid supplement. Which is why you're probably seeing all of these vendors out there starting to sell supplements that either supply thyroid directly or claim to support the function of the thyroid gland. Now, the second, trying to support the thyroid gland, it's not a bad idea. Unfortunately, I think we're beyond that point. And for many people, it is beyond that point. If you have proven biomarker, if you have a state where it's been proven that you are hypothyroid based on temperature, pulse, TSH levels, T4, T3, then supporting your thyroid gland in many cases may not work simply because you're either already oversaturated with these endocrine disruptors, right? Or you are obviously spending time in an environment that's not allowing your thyroid to recover. So at that point, if we're going to be modifying ourselves and not the environment, so ideally we should be moving away from the situation which is causing this problem to start with. But for many people, they feel like it's not a choice. So we're left with supporting the thyroid, but supporting the thyroid with things like, the amino acid L-tyrosine, which is the precursor to thyroid hormones, giving people extracts from broccoli and cabbage and whatnot because they convert estrogen into a less dangerous form. All of these things are good intention, but unfortunately, when you look at the evidence, it doesn't seem to be working. It doesn't seem to be improving the condition. It's nice in theory, but in practice doesn't seem to be leading to better outcomes. So which leaves us with supplying the thyroid hormone either from a gland, which is extracted from an animal like a sheep thyroid gland, pig thyroid gland, beef thyroid gland, goat thyroid gland, or chicken neck soup, which is used to be a very common remedy for flus and in generally for people who are recovering from very serious illness. And modern medicine dismissed it about 50 years ago, saying like, oh, these are grandma's stories. That's not how we do science. As it turns out, it was actually very, very solidly scientific because the thyroid gland of the chicken is in the neck. And when you're doing the chicken neck soup, you're essentially creating a liquid extract of thyroid, right? So that's what probably contributed to the recovery of all of these people in the first half of the 20th century. So that's where we are at. We should probably be looking at somehow supplementing with thyroid if we feel that our health is chronically lagging, and there's at least one piece of evidence from all of these tests showing that we're not where we should be in terms of the thyroid biomarkers. They don't have all of. So the situation is that even if one of them is out of whack, that's already an indication, right? The body is a remarkable mechanism of balancing things out and trying to keep you as healthy as it can. So you can't expect to go to the doctor and then if you have a thyroid condition, then all of the thyroid biomarkers to be out of whack. It does happen. It's rare, but it tends to happen towards the more severe case of established thyroid disease. But for most cases, simply having a TSH, just one biomarker, above 2, it's already an indication that things are not going in the right direction.
Yeah, and I want to go back to what you mentioned. It's so key that when you talked about the BPA plastics and also the radiation. I mean, if people will just stop and think for a moment how much we are exposed to those two things. Everything is plastic. And everything, every business you go in, your own home, you're bombarded with Wi-Fi everywhere you go. Plus, we're all carrying around that little rectangle. And where do we generally hold it? Is like right out in front of, it's either in a pocket or right out here, right in line with the thyroid, where it's texting while we're looking at it. Yeah. And I don't think we'd stand in front of an open microwave oven, but yet that's what we're doing with these little devices. And so no matter who you are, you're bombarded with some thyroid destroying paraphernalia in your environment, whether it's the EMF or whether it's the plastics. And so we really do need to take a good hard look at, am I doing all I can to support my thyroid? Also, you mentioned some of the environmental things we were just talking about, but talk to us about some lifestyle practices that people do that could even be harming their thyroid. Like, are there habits that people have that also could be damaging to their thyroid?
So protein deficiency is one of the biggest ones because, as I mentioned, the amino acid L-tyrosine, that's the precursor to thyroid hormone. And it happens to be found mostly in animal foods. So now with this whole movement of being entirely vegan, which has its positives, right? But if you're not consuming any food of animal origin, you're running a severe risk of getting a tyrosine deficiency. And if you don't consume tyrosine, or at least its precursor phenylalanine, it's very likely that you'll run a situation where the thyroid just doesn't have the raw materials to produce thyroid hormone. So, but in general, protein deficiency tends to suppress thyroid activity, even if it provides enough L-tyrosine for the synthesis of thyroid hormones. And if you look at most of the diets that are being recommended these days as optimal, you'll see that it ends up providing about 0.5 gram per kilogram of body weight of protein. And multiple studies have shown that, and even the FDA recommends that a person in suboptimal health, which they don't tell you how many of these are, but now we suspect that it's probably the majority of people, they should be consuming about 1 gram per kilogram of body weight of protein.
0.8, they'll say.
0.8, yes. So I don't think they've raised it to 1, but I think 0.8, right? So, but studies have shown, just sampling the population, show that most people end up consuming about 0.5 gram per kilogram of body weight, and that's woefully inadequate to support the thyroid function. Now, protein has a great satiating effect. It prevents you from gorging up on other foods because you feel like you're hungry and you really need the extra calories. Protein is also thermogenic, so it's together with salt and progesterone. These are the 3 endogenous most potent thermogenic agents. And increasing temperature in general not only helps the thyroid gland, but it helps immune function, helps protect us, especially from viruses, but also from bacteria. It also helps protect from cancer. Older studies in the first half of the 20th century demonstrated that you can actually, in about 40% of the cases, you can make the tumor disappear on its own if you heat it to about 40 degrees Celsius, which I think is about 90 degrees Fahrenheit, right? But guess what? In order to get to that temperature endogenously, you have to consume things that allow you to raise body temperature. And that is protein, salt, keeping progesterone synthesis high. Sugar also helps a lot, right? Avoiding the polyunsaturated fats because they actually lower core body temperature versus the saturated fats, which uncouple your metabolism, and that's the medical term, which means that you produce more heat per unit of food consumed, right? So all of these things are important, and I think most people put themselves in a dietarily induced hypothyroid state simply by having diets that are too restrictive. And by too restrictive, I mean a diet that's entirely vegan is likely to induce a number of deficiencies that will ultimately hurt thyroid function and also reproductive function and skin quality, sleep, intelligence, all of these things. So an overly restrictive diet that doesn't provide enough protein, doesn't provide enough sugar, and doesn't provide enough saturated fats will ultimately lead to some kind of a metabolic derangement. Exhaustive exercise, especially doing it on an empty stomach, which I was horrified to see that FDA actually is now, it didn't recommend it directly, but it said that it concurs with the recommendation of the American Dietitian Association that if any exercise is done, it should be done on an empty stomach. And preferably, when you wake up in the morning, you should be doing whatever you're doing on an empty stomach because it increases the oxidation of fat. Well, as soon as we've discussed in previous shows, as soon as you go into fatty acid oxidation mode beyond a certain level, that is the ultimate stress signal from the environment, and your body goes into defense mode. Starts, while you're running on empty stomach, you will be burning some calories, but as soon as that stops, the body goes into overcompensation mode. Anything you eat after that is likely to be stored, mostly stored, and not turned into energy. The synthesis of hormones immediately declines because it's considered a non-emergency function by the organism. So your core temperature drops, and the body really kind of like, it's almost like you think of the equivalent of a fetal position for your metabolism. It curls up and basically does only the very minimum that is required to keep you alive. So exhaustive exercise done on an empty stomach is really detrimental for your health. Cardiac surgeons know about it. In general, cardiologists know about that, as do urologists and neurologists. So these three professions, actually, if you look at their recommendations, they would say, don't ever do this stuff on an empty stomach because cardiologists say you'll have a much higher risk of a heart attack and or stroke, right? That's probably comes from the elevated estrogen and prolactin when you're doing things on an empty stomach, right? The neurologists are saying similar, like saying like, don't do this because we've seen higher number of strokes in people who do things on an empty stomach, like when they stress themselves voluntarily on an empty stomach. And urologists are saying like, we're seeing an alarming rates of infertility in young people, and we think it's due to over-exercising, or there's something else in their lifestyle that's causing this. But they suspect it's the over-exercising combined with not consuming a sufficient amount of calories and eating an overly restrictive diet. Think about it. Reproduction is a luxury. So if your body thinks that you're not in a state where you can afford luxury, right, then this is one of the first things to go. You don't need it to be alive, right? You don't need your creativity to be alive. You don't need a very high body temperature to be alive. So you're going into the equivalent of hibernation mode. And we are, unfortunately, many of us are putting ourselves into this position very voluntarily. Some of it is due to manipulation from the mass media, but I know quite a few people who are very gung-ho about doing their exercise 6 days a week, not giving themselves only 1 day of rest, doing things on an empty stomach, not eating enough, right? So yes, this leads to weight loss, but guess what? In order for you to keep that weight loss, you have to stay on this thing indefinitely. And in general, even hardcore psychopathic doctors will tell you that if you have to continually do something just to maintain its effects, it's probably not a natural state of life, right? And they've already found out that people who are actually naturally lean, in other words, they don't need to exercise and diet in order to lose weight, are the ones who tend to be healthy. Well, the people who lost their weight through stress and overexerting themselves, they actually more often than not, are actually very sick. And now there's this big debate. What exactly should we be telling people? Should we be telling them that it's not exercise? It's not that losing weight makes you healthier. It's that in general, being healthy leads to weight loss. So the question then is, well, how do we become healthy? If healthy is what's the cause of being lean and looking good and living long and in general enjoying life, then we should be focusing on being healthy. And the metabolic theory says that the way to do that is by supporting thyroid function. Why? Because thyroid is the ultimate conductor of metabolism in every cell, in every organ in your body. Without thyroid, nothing works.
Right. Well, and I'll be the first to admit that I was about maybe 8 years ago diagnosed with exercise-induced menopause. So I had put my body into menopause based on the fact of over-exercising. And come to find out later, I had thyroid issues as well. So I'm so glad you mentioned that while exercise can be a good thing, too much of any sort of a good thing is always a bad thing. So we want to keep it in balance and do it in a way that supports our thyroid rather than damages it. So with regard to individuals that may have not had their blood work done to know, could I possibly have hypothyroidism? What are they looking for as far as symptoms? So talk to us about some of the symptoms that they should just be aware of, because coming from a practitioner standpoint, I look at symptoms more so sometimes than even blood work. Blood work is a snapshot in a month and a week and a day, but symptoms don't lie. If they're ongoing, these are things that we can really be aware of and ask ourselves, wow, maybe I would benefit from a little bit of some natural desiccated thyroid since I have these fill in the blank symptoms.
Right. So some of the first symptoms that come along when you have a problem with your metabolic state is mood, sleep issues, and cognitive issues. Why? Because the brain consumes about 40% of the calories. So in other words, it's such an energetically expensive organ to maintain that if anything goes wrong with the whole production of energy, which is an indication of a problem with thyroid function, right? Ultimately, then one of the first organs that responds to that is the brain. So your mood will sour. Multiple studies have shown that aggression, irritability, anger, and in general behavior that's antisocial and feeling like everything gets on your nerves, that's basically directly caused by a sudden drop of ATP levels in the brain. And ATP the ATP synthesis is one of the best surrogates for thyroid function, right? That's the end product of metabolism. If ATP levels drop, means your metabolism is not working the way it should be. And they reverse that by increasing back ATP levels. But in the animal study that I saw it, they injected ATP directly into the brains of animals. Well, clearly we don't want to do that, right? It's not something you do at home. But there are other ways to raise ATP levels. Taking thyroid is one way. Taking methylene blue is another. Aspirin is actually a great way, and it's probably present in every household in this country, probably around the world. So, so mood, right? So depression, irritability, as I mentioned, feeling like the world is overwhelming you and you're about to collapse. That's like almost like you're about to have a nervous breakdown. All of these things are very good indications that your brain is not receiving enough energy, so it cannot really formulate a plan to deal with the world, right? So cognitive problems, if you start becoming forgetful, if you start having performance issue at work, if people start telling you, if you start finding yourself in situations where you forget about the meetings, you go to a meeting, you forgot what the meeting was about, right? During the meeting, you start spacing out. You're not really, focusing on what the meeting is all about. Now, to the defense of many people going to these meetings, because I've spent 15 years in such meetings. Now, many of them are actually direct thyroid endocrine disruptors themselves, right? Clearly, you don't want to go and talk about most people don't enjoy talking about the last quarterly results, staring at a spreadsheet that's 100 pages long. I mean, that can put anybody in a hypothyroid state, right? But if this happens consistently, even in meetings that you should be enjoying or going to events that you should be enjoying, then chances are that the brain is not receiving the energy that it needs to, and that's ultimately due to a thyroid problem, right? So what do we say? And problems with sleep. Contrary to what many people think, when you get to a point where you're really deficient in energy, you get into a state of, it's not sleepiness, it's basically the tired but wired situation.
Right.
So you don't feel like you want to do anything, yet if you're left alone and you're trying to go to bed and sleep, you can't really fall asleep. Ultimately, in order to be able to relax, also requires energy. Why? Because if the cells are feeling like they're not producing enough energy, they don't get it, so which is as a result of a proper thyroid function, they're going to upregulate the first portion of the metabolism, which is glycolysis. So in order to get enough ATP and enough energy, but the byproduct, the end result of that state of metabolism is lactic acid. And lactic acid is what makes you feel heavy. You're not nimble. You're achy. You can't really sleep well. You're having nightmares. All of these things ultimately have been shown to be due to lactic acid and or adrenaline. And adrenaline just happens to be one of the stress hormones which rises when thyroid is not working properly. So if you're starting experiencing problems with sleep at night, that's one of the first signs that your metabolism is declining. Other very common signs of declining thyroid function is sexual activity, sexual function. if you start feeling like you're not in the mood anymore, even though you're in a situation where you should be, if you go on vacation and things are not happening, people around you are getting angry that you're not in the mood. These are all usually things because, as I said, reproduction, biologically speaking, is a form of luxury. It requires about as much energy as very highly creative cognitive function. And it's not a coincidence that many of the greatest artists were also very sexually capable, because if you're capable of creating really, really high quality art, this implies that you're in a very good metabolic state, and one of the side effects of that is proper sexual function, right? So sexual dysfunction both in males and females is also a very common sign of metabolism declining. What other things? Skin quality. If your skin starts getting dry, if your hair starts getting brittle, if you start getting these random, why should I call them random? You start getting these spots, often they're reddish, sometimes they're of the irregular shape. In general, if you feel like your skin is itchy or it's not it doesn't look good, right? And often people will comment on that too. That's also a great sign. Should I say great, but it's a very common and reliable sign of declining metabolism. It's also a very common sign of problems with digestion. In general, whatever the quality of your skin is, it mimics very closely the quality of the health, the state of health of your gastrointestinal tract. Hair quality. Many women will tell you that one of the first symptoms that they were about to get into menopause was the hair looked horrific. It was thinning. It was brittle. It was breaking all the time, and no shampoo was able to. And the shampoo may help for a day or two, but as soon as they stop using it, they go right back into that state. And even the shampoo they felt like it was only doing a very cosmetic kind of effect. So yeah, hair quality, because again, hair quality is a luxury. Anything that we mention here as a luxury is just a euphemism for it requires a lot of energy. And all of this energy can only come if the cells are performing the so-called oxidative metabolism, which is entirely dependent on thyroid function. So anytime oxidative metabolism suffers, you go back to the primitive mode of metabolism, which is glycolysis, and then all hell breaks loose because the body starts to get rid of, or at least greatly decrease the effectiveness and the functionality of tissues, organs, and systems inside of you that the body thinks are dispensable, right? So, but the good news is you can recover them pretty quickly if you restore that proper level of oxidative metabolism.
And talk to me about the eyes, because this is something you don't hear a lot of people talk about. Is one way I was able to figure out something was wrong with me. Now, this was more during my toxic mold exposure, but my eyes gave it away. Like, they were so red and puffy and uncomfortable, and it wasn't like an irritation. It was more like I would wake with puffy eyes, and I was eating all the same healthy foods I always had, but my eyes showed it to everyone. It was really damaging, and I don't think that people think about thyroid issues and eye issues. So can you talk about that?
Sure. Actually, at this point, even mainstream medicine has admitted that the redness of the eyes, unless it's caused by like a local irritant, right? Like you rub your eye after touching spicy bell peppers, right? Unless it's caused by something direct like that, usually the redness of the eyes is an indication of elevated lactic acid, because it's lactic acid that's promoting the growth of these micro blood vessels, and they're mostly visible in the eye. So if you see people that have these really like red eyes, and you can see the red blood vessels clearly, that suggests that they have elevated lactic acid. And it's just as we explained, elevated lactic acid is a sign of the body's declining oxidative metabolism and a shift towards the primitive low energy yield metabolism known as glycolysis. Histamine is probably one of the direct contributors to the puffiness of the eyes, and histamine levels rise, and they correlate almost perfectly with the decline of thyroid function. Both the synthesis of histamine from the amino acid L-histidine and also the degradation of histamine depends on enzymes that are heavily influenced by thyroid levels. So if your thyroid function is not working properly, the enzyme that degrades histamine will also not work properly, because one of its cofactors is ATP. What is a cofactor? It's the thing without which that enzyme cannot work. So if an ATP just happens to be both the end product of metabolism, of oxidative metabolism, the proper kind, and a cofactor in virtually every reaction, enzymatic reaction in the body. And without the enzymatic reactions, we simply cannot exist. So if ATP levels are low, across the board, almost everything slows down. And one of the things that slow down are the degradations of serotonin and histamine, and those two in combination are responsible for the puffiness and itchiness, especially itchiness of the eyes. And then the lactic acid will usually cause the redness.
I love that you filled us in on that, because I think if people will look at themselves in the eyes, sometimes they might see firsthand that something's going on. So
yeah, if it's something very simple, just go to Google and type lactic acid, red eyes. Immediately you'll see a number of studies and doctors opining and saying that if your eyes are chronically red, maybe you should be asking the doctor to maybe do a blood test for either carbon dioxide or lactic acid directly. Why carbon dioxide? Because it's the opposite. It's sort of like an antagonist of lactic acid. If your carbon dioxide is low on a test, almost guaranteed that your lactic acid will be high. So it's an easy way to test of how much lactic acid you're producing. And by the way, the levels of carbon dioxide depend on what? Thyroid function and metabolism. So that's another great way of evaluating your thyroid function. But going back to your symptoms, since you said you prefer the symptoms, and so do I think one of the the three easiest ways are probably measuring waking temperature, underarm waking temperature. Used to be the standard test for hypothyroidism back in the 60s and 70s until they came up with the blood test. Then heart rate. When you're waking up, the heart rate would probably be, in a normal person, would probably be in about 60 to 70 beats per minute. And when you eat, you would want to see that heart rate rise. If the heart rate when you wake up is high and after you eat is actually dropping down, that's one of the classic signs that you were running on stress hormones, that your cortisol and adrenaline were high, because it's adrenaline that raises the heart rate. And when you ate, that lowered the stress hormones, and suddenly your heart was able to perform the same work, to produce the same effects with a lot less work, hence the declining of the heart rate. And the gold standard, perhaps the most objective measurement of thyroid function is the relaxation of the Achilles tendon. So, but it can be done by a doctor in any office. And what they do is I think many people have seen these hammers that the doctors use to hit on your knees and sort of like measure your reflexes, right? So if you take that same hammer and you lie face down on the doctor's couch, and then basically they'll hit your Achilles tendon with this hammer, and then they'll measure how quickly, because when they hit your nerve, then you have this reaction, and then depending on how quickly the nerve relaxes and allows the foot to retreat, that's a great measurement of thyroid function. People who are hypothyroid, it takes them a very long time for the nerve and the muscles to relax and allow a retraction into a normal position. For healthy people, this happens relatively quickly, probably in a matter of a few seconds. For the hypothyroid people, it can take 10, 15, sometimes up to 30 seconds to produce this relaxation. So that's another great test, but usually performed by doctors because they know the exact position of the nerve and how to hit it. For the vast majority of the population, waking temperature and heart rate and how these change after breakfast is probably one of the best indicators you can have.
A test that we had learned about when I was going through my nutrition therapy practitioner training was the lower part of the shin. You could press on this, just right on the edge of the shin, if you pressed on it and then watched how much your finger imprint went away. Like within 10 seconds, it should go away. And you can actually do this even just wearing a pair of socks. You take your socks off, and if the sock indentation stays for quite a bit of time, that's an indication of a thyroid issue, mainly because it's causing you to retain water. Is that where that is coming from?
That's right, exactly. So when you press, and basically you're expelling some of the water, and the blood, and then when you release, how quickly the blood repopulates that tissue is actually as an indication of how well this tissue absorbs blood and oxygen and nutrients. And if it's staying pale for a while after pressing it, it's usually not a good sign. Those would be some of the things that are a pretty good indication of where your thyroid function stands.
Yeah, so that's some practical things people can do alongside looking at their symptoms. There's
another test I wanted to mention.
Go ahead.
It's not very practical, but everybody can do it at home. So basically, looking at the ratio between water that is perspired versus water that gets excreted. And people with higher metabolism released more water through perspiration and in general through metabolic processes than through urine. So let's say a great test would be, and in general, you utilize about a liter of water per a quart of water, we're using the American metrics, for about 1,000 calories burned. So let's say if you drink 3 liters of water daily, that's about 3/4 of a gallon. And then you measure how much you pee out of it, what percentage of that you pee out. If you pee out 2 liters, that means you only burn 1,000 calories. So it's actually a very good way to measure very, very accurately how many calories per day you burn. It's really very scientific, and they actually do it in metabolic clinics as one of the metrics of how many calories a day you burn. But it's not very convenient because it requires tracking urine, how much you drink, how much liquids you drink, how many liquids you drink, and also how much. It can be a little bit imprecise because you don't have an easy way of measuring how much liquid is in the food you're ingesting. So I guess it can be done by doing, like choosing a day and doing only like a liquid diet only, maybe orange juice, right? So if you want to do like a 1 day of the week to do a test of your metabolism, try to only drink orange juice with a little bit of salt and see how much, because you know how much liquid is in the orange juice, it's mostly liquid, and then see how much, how big your urine output is. And the difference between the two is basically your metabolic output in calories, in terms of calories.
I like that. Who wouldn't like a liquid day of orange juice, right?
And measuring and collecting the urine and measuring.
Yeah, sounds like a great day. Okay, so you had talked about L-tyrosine and certain things that by themselves, we can't really rely on them to be big, huge movers of the thyroid. But are there specific, before we get into natural desiccated thyroid, because we are going to go there next, are there specific herbs that you know of and minerals perhaps that can actually be really valuable, such as ashwagandha? So could ashwagandha actually be something could be really valuable for amping up thyroid function?
Yeah, actually, ashwagandha, even though the official mechanism of action is unknown, it's an herb commonly used in Ayurveda medicine. But certain studies have come out already showing that it reduces the synthesis of serotonin. And serotonin happens to be the primary endogenous block on your metabolic rate, together with estrogen. So anything that lowers estrogen and or serotonin is likely to have a pro-metabolic effect. One of the effects of aspirin, even though it does have an uncoupling effect and it stimulates respiration through different mechanisms, one of the effects of aspirin is actually reducing the synthesis of estrogen, and that has a direct positive effect on metabolism. Vitamin E is another chemical that opposes estrogen and potentially partially serotonin. It also happens to be pro-metabolic. Vitamin K, vitamin A, vitamin D, all of these happen to have anti-estrogenic pro-progesterone effects. And speaking of progesterone is probably the closest you can take to thyroid if you don't want to take thyroid.
Okay.
It mimics almost all of the thyroid's effects. And the only drawback to it that I know of is that because progesterone is a GABA agonist, so-called, it makes people sleepy. But aside from that, if you don't want to take thyroid and if you don't want to mess with your endogenous thyroid function, progesterone is probably the closest you can get to getting the effects of thyroid without actually using thyroid. Minerals such as salt, magnesium, potassium, and calcium, all of the 4 minerals that we know, they all play a highly important role in metabolism. Calcium is extremely important for the functioning of the enzyme pyruvate dehydrogenase, which is the limiting step of metabolism and links the primitive metabolism known as glycolysis with the high-level mammalian metabolism known as oxidative phosphorylation. Calcium. Sodium raises temperature, lowers adrenaline, increases the degradation of serotonin, very importantly. So I think you asked me, didn't you ask me over email what can people do to sort of recover from SSRI usage?
Yes.
I think I mentioned salt is one of the options because the SSRI drugs all universally have this effect. That's why they call it SSRI drugs. This stands for selective serotonin reuptake inhibitor. And the way they work is they inhibit a protein known as the serotonin transporter. It's an enzyme in the body. And that protein deactivates serotonin. So when you inhibit that protein, more serotonin will be available. So if you want to reverse that effect, one way is to increase the activity of that protein. And that protein just happens to to use as a cofactor sodium. So baking soda and salt and other sources of sodium, if you have them in your in your diet, are probably the best ways to increase sodium intake, and it results in lower levels of extracellular serotonin. And like I said, serotonin is perhaps the primary brake on metabolism together with estrogen. So anything that lowers estrogen and serotonin is likely to be your friend, from diet or as a lifestyle. What about lifestyle? Well, doing creative, pleasurable things happens to powerfully lower serotonin and estrogen and promote dopamine, which is known as the pleasure chemical. Now, they wrongfully named serotonin as the happiness chemical, but that's pretty corrupt, and it's only been pushed into the public space over the last 20, 30 years. Before that, it was dopamine that was known as the happy chemical and the pleasure chemical, and serotonin was more known for more of like the discipline chemical. So soldiers have high levels of serotonin. Any situation that encourages routine, overly rigid behavior, or being among people who have power over you, anything like that increases serotonin and lowers dopamine. So anything that reverses that situation, such as doing pleasurable, interesting, creative things with people you like and they like you, is a powerful anti-serotonin and pro-metabolic effect.
The serotonin thing, we're definitely going to have to do a video on all the many ways to decrease serotonin. I was looking some things up, and it's like you said, they talk about so much about how to increase serotonin and how serotonin is our happy hormone, and people are missing the mark when they're getting it way too high and wondering why they don't feel good and why they're so agitated and irritated. So yeah, we're definitely going to have to continue talking more about that. So with regard to natural desiccated thyroid, let's talk about that, because there is a way to get it without going to like a holistic practitioner and getting on Armour or NatureThyroid or Westthyroid. But you have to be careful about what is out there and where it's sourced from. So talk to us about like what to look for in a natural desiccated thyroid and what to watch out for as well.
Okay, so probably the first and cheapest option that I want to mention was to remind people back of the chicken neck soup, right?
Yes.
So, or like turkey neck.
Not chicken noodle soup.
Not chicken noodle soup, no, chicken neck, right?
Right.
And also fish head soup used to be a very common thing, right? So in general, any part of if you're eating any kind of an animal, make sure you eat the part that contains the thyroid. So it just happens to be that, based on our dietary habits, fish heads and chicken necks are probably the cheapest and most widely accessible ways to get thyroid into our diet. Mm-hmm. But if you're going to be buying natural desiccated thyroid, make sure you're getting one that is preferably, so far the studies show that bovine thyroid seems to work the best, because pigs are very much like us. The quality of their thyroid gland depends heavily on their diet, and it does so in the beef, in the cows, in the bulls as well, in the bovine animals as well. However, they're less sensitive to their diets. Basically, they can eat mostly grass and grain, but they have ways to neutralize many of the bad effects of a fully grain diet. While pigs are just like us. They get fed mostly grains and mostly soy, actually, because it's so cheap to produce and feed them, and it has a higher amount of protein. It's not a good quality protein, but if you're raising thousands or tens of thousands of these massive numbers of pigs, you're going to try to feed them something that's as cheap as possible, right? Mm-hmm. So they get fed really bad food, and it translates into many of the pigs themselves actually having the equivalent of Hashimoto disease. So you're getting a thyroid, if it's of porcine origin, usually you'll be getting a thyroid that is almost like the thyroid of a person who already has the disease. It's not entirely useless, but I would prefer ovine, which is from sheep, or bovine thyroid. And those basically need to be naturally desiccated and undisturbed. And what I mean by undisturbed, so when you're reaching out to the vendor, you should be asking them, is this the entire thyroid gland, or has it been processed and or fractionated in any specific way? What do I mean by fractionated? Almond thyroid used to be an excellent quality product until the people who owned the trademarks to it and in general were allowed to sell the product realized that there are many substances inside the thyroid gland that can be sold separately for additional profit. One of the ingredients of a regular thyroid gland is the protein known as calcitonin. Calcitonin is used to decrease the levels of calcium in the blood, and many people have a problem with either higher than normal calcium levels or at the borderline, and that can cause many issues. The biggest one of which is soft tissue calcification. All this calcium floating around in the blood has to go somewhere. So cancer patients have very high levels of calcium in the blood. People with osteoporosis happen to have high levels of calcium in the blood. People on birth control pills containing estrogen also have high levels of calcium in their blood. And calcitonin happens to bind calcium and prevent it from doing all of these bad things to your soft tissues. It also, in many cases, able to actually lower the levels of calcium in the blood. So the vendor that was selling Armor said, oh, wow, what a remarkable substance. Let us extract it and isolate it from the gland and sell it separately and sell the gland without it, right? Then there's also, the gland contains a protein known as thyroglobulin. This is the protein inside of our body that when you ingest thyroid, the thyroid binds to thyroglobulin, and that's how it gets transported around the body and gets delivered to the tissues that need it. So because it's also used in scientific research in many different studies, especially on autoimmune thyroid diseases, now there's a great demand for thyroglobulin. So the Armor vendor said, oh, what a great ingredient. Let us extract that one as well and sell it separately as a product. So let's sell what remains of the Armor, right? Well, many people don't know, but their T3 and T4 are not the only thyroid hormones. There's also T1 and T2, and there are multiple metabolites, others that basically are reminiscent of the thyroid molecule, and all of them seem to have a synergistic effect when administered together. But guess what? Again, Armor vendor said, oh, wow, we can sell all of these things separately because there is a demand for them, and we can source them very easily. So let's extract even those out of the thyroid of the Armor. And little by little, the Armor thyroid went from a full-featured, truly a natural glandular extract, a desiccated gland in its full composition, the way it was taken from the animal. It went from that state to a state where at this point, I think the analysis, the latest one that I've seen, is that the Armor thyroid contains mostly T4 and very little T3 and not much else. So you're basically getting the equivalent of the doctor putting you on thyroxine, which is the standard therapy for hypothyroidism. But as many of your listeners probably know, getting put on pure T4 therapy is usually a recipe for disaster because it's the T3 that's the real thyroid hormone. T4 has to be converted into T3 in order to work. So if you're getting too much T4, a lot of it gets converted to something called reverse T3, and that has the effect of acting in the exact opposite way as thyroid hormone. It can actually make you hypothyroid. So if your doctor is pumping you full of T4, you are actually not getting the benefit of treatment with thyroid. So what to look for in a thyroid gland, I would call it or email the vendor. Usually doing email is better because it's in writing, and it's a great disincentive for the vendors to lie, because even though they can lie on the phone, when they're being asked a direct question about the ingredients, they either have to refuse to answer it or they have to answer you truthfully. There is a law that mandates that. Doesn't mean they will not go on a lie, but it is a more incentive for them to tell you the truth or refuse to answer you when you're doing it in writing. So the questions would be, is this the whole gland? Has it been fractionated and processed in any way so that any of the ingredients inside of it has been removed? And if yes, which ones, right? So, if it has been adulterated in any way, you'll probably get a response saying that, well, we removed calcitonin, or, oh, well, we removed T3. And then you can dig further in and say, like, well, why did you do that? You see what kind of response you're getting. But at this point, you're not, even though you're getting advertised natural desiccated thyroid, there's very little that's left as natural in it. So you should probably be looking for another vendor.
I have had several clients that have switched from what their practitioner gave them was Armor or Westhroid or NatureThroid to your particular product called TyroMax, and have noticed within the first month a vast array of better feeling than they ever did on Armor or Westhroid or NatureThroid. So you can tell exactly what you're saying. They're getting all of the things that are making their thyroid function more optimally versus leaving out some key ingredients. So tell me about TyroMax, and tell the listeners how you source it and just the info they can derive from it.
So TyroMax is basically 100% bovine. We've had different batches. Some of them were porcine, but because of me continuously reading about thyroid, I became convinced that porcine thyroid, if it should be used as last resort, if there's nothing else available. So it's 100% bovine organic thyroid, natural desiccated gland. And we're sourcing it from a company. They're both a compounding pharmacy and also a chemical vendor. And they themselves are getting it directly from Amish farms in Pennsylvania. At least that's what we've been told. They sent us a document which for some batches they can even tell you like exactly which zip code the bovine thyroid came from. Now they don't tell you exactly the name of the cow because you're probably getting since it's powder, you're probably getting a mixture of several animals in there. But we know for many batches exactly where those came from. So it's all produced in the United States. Nothing is imported from other countries. And I know now, especially with the virus outbreaks in other countries, there's some concern about that too, right? So we prefer to only use products that are produced / sourced within the United States, because as much as people like to vilify the American system, it's one of the most robust systems for quality control in the world. And the laws surrounding it and basically the penalties that are there for lying and selling adulterated products are pretty severe. So if you're getting it from a good place that can prove that it's the unadulterated thyroid gland, it's probably best that you get it from within the United States. So that's where we're getting ours from. It's all coming from about 5 to 7 farms, Amish farms in Pennsylvania.
Okay. And what about, you have a specific also a T3 supplement called tyrosine. Can you talk about that?
So because many people got disappointed by Armour thyroid, basically there's been a demand for the synthetic hormones, which is the isolated version of T3 and the isolated version of T4. So we created a mixture. If people want to buy, we are not allowed to advertise it for human use, but for those who want to experiment, it is a pure solution of T3 in ethanol and saturated fatty acids. So it's the equivalent of the product known as Cytomel. And it's a Mexican product, or at least the company selling it is in Mexico, but it's available worldwide. There's another one, I think it's produced by Pfizer, and is known as TyroMel, but that one is mostly available in Europe. Either way, both of these products contain the T3 hormone, which is the active thyroid hormone, and we created something similar using pharmaceutical grade T3 known as liothyronine sodium. It's the sodium salt, the sodium ester of the T3 hormone. And it's, like I said, it's dissolved in ethanol and saturated fat. There's nothing else in it. So it arrives in a small bottle, and it's dispensed as these colorless, tasteless drops. They have a little bit of taste like ethanol because there's ethanol there, right? So it's like putting drops of vodka in your mouth if you taste it. And the TyroMax is virtually the same design, but instead of only the T3, it also has a T4 in it, and it's in a ratio of 2:1 of T4 to T3. And that ratio is specific because in the actual thyroid gland, the natural ratio is 4:1, sometimes even 5:1 in favor of the T4. But as we mentioned earlier, in hypothyroid people, the conversion of T4 into T3 is greatly hindered. So you don't want to be overdoing the T4 in a hypothyroid person who is severely hypothyroid. For some severely hypothyroid people, you need basically more T3, or in other words, lower ratio of T4 to T3, and that's the purpose of TyroMax. So it's the same product as tyrosine, but you're getting T4 on top of that, and the ratio is 2:1.
A couple last questions about just natural desiccated thyroid in general. Is this something that can help people with weight loss? And conversely, if they take it inappropriately, can it lead to weight gain?
Yes, actually, thyroid medication was one of the main methods of weight loss in the early 20th century. The other one was the notorious drug known as dinitrophenol, DNP. So if you Google for DNP weight loss, you will likely get articles. If you look at some of the older articles which the FDA themselves published back in the 1920s and 1930s, the two main methods for weight loss back in the day were either increasing your intake of natural desiccated thyroid and or using DNP. Now, DNP turned out to be very dangerous, and there were many cases of death because it's so difficult to use the wrong dosage, and it can really kill you through overheating. So for about 80 years, up until like the late 80s, thyroid remained as the preferred pharmacological method of causing weight loss. If you go to your doctor and you're becoming morbidly obese, right, or in general piling up the weight real fast, if you go to your doctor, the first thing they'll do is search for an endocrine disorder, right? And if they feel like your metabolism is slowing down, even though you may not be technically considered hypothyroid, they would prescribe thyroid, and in many cases it would lead to weight loss. Now, because the T4 can convert into reverse T3 and have the effect of being a thyroid blocker or thyroid antagonist, yes, if you overdo the natural desiccated gland and you pump yourself full of T4, because as I said, the ratio is 4-to-1 up to 5-to-1, so you're getting a decent amount of T4 when you're consuming naturally desiccated thyroid. So if you take too much too quickly, a lot of this will get converted to reverse T3, and you may end up being more hypothyroid than before. And of course, drop in metabolism while maintaining the same amount of calories will result in weight gain.
So someone should really work with a practitioner when experimenting with these things. However, it does sound like that even someone who hasn't been diagnosed with thyroid issues would just benefit somewhat of trying some natural desiccated thyroid, or just increasing their consumption, like you said, the chicken neck soup, just to give our body a little supplementation, a little natural boost of something that we really can benefit from.
Absolutely, yes. I fully agree. I myself eat the chicken neck soup at least twice a week. I found a local kitchen. It's a Vietnamese restaurant, but they actually offer services. They actually do custom cooking on demand if you pay them. So, and because they eat a lot of chicken, they actually eat a lot of quail. So lately I've been getting quail neck soup, and it tastes amazing. They just give me the stock after they boil the necks for like half an hour, however long it takes. It's really, really nutritious, and you can feel a kick, right? After you just drinking this liquid, it's semi-transparent. It does taste like chicken soup, but unlike chicken soup, after that, you start sweating, you feel hot, you feel energetic. So you're getting something more than just this misleadingly bland looking soup.
Oh, I love that. Okay, I'm going to start seeing if I can source some locally too. And also, my husband and I are bow hunters, so apparently we need to start saving the thyroid of the deer that we get. So
absolutely, yes.
That's something to consider for next year's hunting season. So.
And actually, the thyroid gland of even a single deer can probably last both of you for like at least a month or two, depending on how much you want to take. So yeah, so you don't have to. It's not like you need to hunt deer every week in order to get your thyroid supplies. Like, once a month or, once every 2 months is probably enough.
Awesome. Okay. Well, that's on my agenda then. Okay. So how can they find your TyroMax, your Tyronine? Where can people find that?
The TyroMax can be found directly on our website, www.idealabsdc.com. And then we also have a section for lab chemicals sold for research and development. So it's the same address, but after the .com, you put / and then lab. So the TyroMax is on the main website, and the Tyronine and TyroMix are in the lab section, in other words, / lab. So all of them can be ordered together, even though they're two separate pages.
Yeah. And they won't find a lot of information on the lab chemicals as far as dosage or anything like that. So that's something they would want to work with a practitioner on.
Exactly. Yes, that's my recommendation. Yeah.
And also, how can people learn more about you? Tell us where they can find you.
Well, by watching your shows, right?
That's right.
And also going to, I have a blog now, and basically I post online under the alias Heydut, spelled Hai, D as in dog, U, T as in Tom. So I have a blog, which is the address is heydut.me, M-E, and I have a Twitter account, which is the email sign and then Heydut. And then both of these are probably like the main methods to keep up with my work, because I post there, about scientific studies. Lately, I've started doing my own scientific studies. I'll send you the link. Yeah. The Cortisone product, which we discussed previously, now already has a study published about it, with it. And you can start sending it to your listeners if they're interested. But in general, these two venues, the Twitter and the blog, is if you keep track of those, you'll know pretty much everything that I'm currently working on.
Yeah, I heard about that study when watching Danny Roddy's podcast, so I was wanting to congratulate you on that. And yes, please send me the link. I'll include it in this show, and then I'll also spread the word. So.
Okay, thanks a lot. Appreciate it.
Thank you. Thanks again for doing this, and we'll be in touch for the next podcast.
Thanks, Janelle. Thanks for having me.
Bye. Thanks for watching, everybody. Bye for now. I'm like a librarian. Come into my library. Don't mind the excessive blue light because I have blue blockers for you. Oh, there's some sort of schmutz on this one. So with so many options on the Swanwick website, I thought I'd show you some of the different fits and show you just how cool blocking blue light can be and stylish at the same time. My favorite are actually the cat eyes, so I like those the best. It's like I could like go to a sock hop. Do monkey. So it's cool. You can actually be stylish and be blocking the blue light at the same time with Swanwick sleep glasses, or Swannies as they're called. Now, not just for adults, okay? So here I have my daughter's little blue blockers. Obviously they're gonna be a little small on me, in case you want them in blue or pink. They also have pink on the website. She likes her purple ones, so I think if I really wanted to, whoops, I dropped that one. If I really wanted to get the benefit of blocking as much blue light as possible, simply, okay, I think that's really gonna do it as far as, yeah, okay. So there you have options. Now these here, these are the fit overs that fit over, like when I wear my glasses, I'll put these on and they fit over. So for people that wear glasses, there's that option. Then for people that are looking for daylight blocking, we have the day blockers in the black, but if you don't want the black, then you have the two-tone. So there's those. Can you tell I have a little bit of an addiction to blue blockers? So while I was making the video, I forgot I had these too. So these are kind of like the clear Wayfarers. So I literally have, okay, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, well, 9 pairs if you count my daughter's 2 pair. I have an issue. SwanwickSleep.com. Get Fit is the code, GETFIT, to save 10% and find a pair that works for you. What are you going to pick? Post below and let me know. Bye.